Ethan Harris had always lived a simple life, working a mid-level engineering job, content with the routine of it all. The idea of intergalactic politics had always felt like a distant concept, something discussed on the news, but never affecting him personally. That all changed on an otherwise uneventful Monday morning. As he sipped his coffee, watching the news on his holoscreen, an official government emblem flashed across the broadcast. He set his mug down, heart suddenly racing. Civilian transmissions were rare, especially on such a high level. Ethan Harris. A calm, authoritative voice spoke through the static. You have been selected as Earth's representative for the royal marriage pact with the Zyian Empire. Your presence is required immediately at the intergalactic spaceport. Your compliance is mandatory under Article 7 of the Treaty of Unified Worlds. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the floor as Ethan stared at the screen in shock. He could barely process what he was hearing. The royal marriage pact was something he had heard about, but it always seemed like a distant, ceremonial obligation. The Zyian were known for their beauty and advanced technology, but also their cold and calculated way of handling political alliances. And now, Ethan had somehow been chosen for this. His mind raced, jumping between confusion and disbelief. Why me? He whispered to the empty room. He wasn't a diplomat, nor a politician. He was just an engineer from a small town. There was no reason why he, of all people, would be involved in something as monumental as this. As he hurriedly packed his belongings under the watchful eyes of the officials who had shown up at his doorstep, Ethan's thoughts circled back to the Zyian. He knew very little about them aside from the fact that they were physically stunning, bioluminescent skin that shimmered like jewels and a grace that humans could hardly comprehend. But there was one rumor, one shadow hanging over the otherwise perfect Zyian royal family. Princess Althea, the Emperor's daughter, was different. Hidden from public view, her appearance was said to be so shocking that even her own people avoided speaking about her. Ethan shuddered at the thought. He didn't know what she looked like, and the thought of marrying someone he had never seen, much less an alien, left a cold knot in his stomach. But this was more than a personal decision. His marriage was part of a larger, unbreakable political agreement. A union between Earth and Zyian, meant to secure peace and mutual benefit between their worlds. It didn't matter what he wanted. Before he knew it, Ethan was standing in the terminal of the intergalactic spaceport, looking up at the sleek, metallic ship that would carry him away from Earth. There was no turning back now. He was expected to fulfill his duty, whether he liked it or not. The officials ushered him aboard with cold efficiency, and he found himself alone in a small, dimly lit cabin. The walls hummed softly as the ship powered up for departure, and he sat down, trying to calm his frayed nerves. His mind wouldn't stop racing. What was Althea really like? Was she truly as hideous as the rumors suggested? Would she resent him, this human who had been forced into her life just as much as she had been forced into his? He leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling as the ship began to hum louder. The gravity shifted subtly, signaling the jump to light speed was about to happen. A deep, sinking feeling washed over him as he realized just how far he was from everything he had known, how far he was about to go, not just physically, but into an entirely different life. As the ship made the jump, a blur of stars streaking past his window, Ethan felt the weight of it all crash down on him. He had no idea what awaited him on the other side of this journey, no idea what his life would look like once he landed on the Zyian home planet. All he knew was that, for better or worse, everything was about to change. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The ship docked smoothly, and Ethan stepped out into a world that felt more like a dream than reality. The Zyian capital was unlike anything he could have imagined. Towers of crystalline structures shimmered in the sunlight, each building a masterpiece of light and form. The city felt alive, pulsating with an energy that seemed to ripple through the air itself. He had never seen a place so otherworldly, so impossibly grand. Yet, for all its beauty, it felt strangely sterile. The Zyian who moved gracefully through the streets looked at him with curious, yet distant expressions. Their bioluminescent skin glowed faintly as they passed by, but there was no warmth in their eyes. It was as if the entire population carried an air of detachment, an emotional coldness that hung in the atmosphere like mist. Ethan felt small, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of it all. His heart pounded as he was led by Xyloxian officials toward the palace, a massive structure that glittered like a mountain of glass. The rumors about the Xyloxians' elegance and beauty had not been exaggerated. They were otherworldly, their movements smooth and graceful, their faces like living artwork. But that beauty seemed almost hollow to Ethan, as though the Xyloxians lacked something he couldn't quite place. As much as their elegance fascinated him, it unnerved him just as deeply. As the palace loomed closer, Ethan's mind returned to Princess Althea. He had heard so much about her but knew so little. The secrecy surrounding her had only fueled his anxiety. The rumors of her being different, the talk of her appearance, all of it weighed on his mind. He tried to brace himself for what was to come, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to face something far beyond what he had prepared for. The palace was quiet, its halls expansive and eerily still as he was escorted through them. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous spaces, adding to the tension building inside him. Finally, the moment came. He was led into a chamber where, for the first time, he would meet Princess Althea. The room was vast and dimly lit, and in the center stood a figure, draped in a dark cloak. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The cloak was lifted slowly, and for a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. Princess Althea was indeed unlike any Xyloxian he had seen. Her features were asymmetrical, her body slightly awkward in its form, and her skin, though glowing, had patterns and textures that were a stark contrast to the smooth perfection of the others. She didn't fit the standard of beauty set by her people or by human standards. Yet there was something about her that immediately struck Ethan, something beyond the physical. He couldn't quite put it into words, but her presence carried an intensity that felt almost magnetic. Her large, violet eyes, though unsettling at first, held an intelligence and a vulnerability that seemed to pierce through the walls he had built around himself. There was no arrogance in her, no sense of entitlement. Instead, she seemed aware of the distance between them, as though she, too, was bracing herself for judgment. For a moment, they stood in silence, neither of them knowing how to begin. Ethan felt his thoughts jumbled together. His mind raced with conflicting emotions. Althea was different, yes, but not in the way he had expected. He had braced himself for something grotesque, something he might instinctively recoil from, but instead, what he saw before him was a being who seemed deeply aware of her isolation, someone who had lived with the weight of being set apart from her own people. It wasn't her appearance that unsettled him, it was the complexity he saw in her, a depth he hadn't anticipated. Ethan wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. Althea remained still, her violet eyes studying him carefully, as if waiting for the inevitable reaction. He wondered what she expected, fear? Disgust? Pity? He felt none of those things, though he was overwhelmed by the sheer strangeness of the situation. He was standing in front of someone who was both entirely alien and, in a strange way, entirely relatable. The door opened behind them, breaking the tense silence. Xyloxian attendants entered, signaling the end of their first meeting. It had been brief, and yet Ethan was left reeling. As the officials ushered him away, his mind churned with thoughts he couldn't untangle. He had been prepared to marry an alien, but nothing could have prepared him for the complexity of Althea. There was so much more to her than the rumors suggested. She was different, yes, but different in a way that made him question everything he had assumed about this arrangement. As Ethan walked back to his quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that the meeting had barely scratched the surface. Something in Althea's eyes lingered in his thoughts, a mixture of fear, intelligence, and a kind of silent plea. She was far more than the ugly princess he had expected. The question that now gnawed at him was whether he would be able to see past the surface and connect with her in a way that mattered. The weight of it all pressed down on him as he lay awake that night, wondering what the future held, and whether he had the courage to find out. The wedding was nothing like Ethan could have ever imagined. The hall, filled with light and crystal that seemed to float in the air, was breathtaking, almost too perfect to be real. Everything shimmered, alive with an energy he couldn't quite grasp. As he stood beside Althea, waiting for the ceremony to begin, a weight settled over him. He knew this wasn't just about vows or exchanging rings. There was something far deeper happening here, something he wasn't prepared for. When they began to speak the ceremonial words, he felt it, the strange pull between them. It wasn't like the nervousness of a typical marriage. It was something else, something entirely alien. A connection, unfamiliar and overwhelming, formed between them. It started as a faint hum in the back of his mind but quickly grew into a powerful surge. As their hands touched, it was as though he could feel her thoughts, her emotions, bleeding into his own. It wasn't just physical, it was deeper than that. He could sense her nervousness, her fears, and her uncertainty, just as clearly as he could feel his own. Ethan had never felt anything like it before, and it left him reeling. The bond, as the Xyloxians called it, wasn't just a metaphor. It was real, tangible, and now it connected him to Althea in ways he couldn't comprehend. He had heard about the Xyloxians' ability to connect mentally, but he hadn't understood the magnitude of it. It wasn't just a surface-level telepathy. This bond reached into the core of who they were. After the ceremony, the sensations only grew stronger. He found himself experiencing flashes of her emotions, her doubts, her hopes, her deep-rooted fear of rejection. It hit him hard because they mirrored his own in so many ways. But what shook him the most was how vulnerable it made him feel. For the first time, someone else had access to his innermost thoughts, emotions, fears. The idea of being that exposed terrified him. He wasn't sure how to react. Part of him wanted to pull away, to block it out, to maintain some sense of privacy. But the bond didn't work that way. It was always there, hovering in the background, like an open channel between them. And Althea, he could sense, felt the same hesitation. She was tentative, unsure of how much to let him in, aware that the bond might be too much for him to handle. Yet, despite her uncertainty, there was a quiet strength in her, a determination to make this work, even if either of them fully understood it yet. Ethan spent the next few days trying to navigate the new reality. Every time he was near her, the connection buzzed with life. He would catch glimpses of her emotions, and they would stir something inside him, like echoes of thoughts he hadn't fully formed. It was unnerving, and he didn't know how to process it. At times it was too much. He would be hit with waves of her emotions that weren't his, leaving him disoriented, unsure of where his feelings ended and hers began. He didn't know how to talk to her about it, how to bring up the fact that he was overwhelmed by the intensity of their bond. And yet, despite the confusion, there was something undeniably profound about it. Then came the vision. One evening, as they sat together in silence, the connection between them seemed to shift. It deepened, pulling him into something far more intense than he had experienced before. Without warning, Ethan found himself seeing through Althea's eyes. It was disorienting at first, like being thrown into a memory that wasn't his. But as the vision became clearer, he realized what he was witnessing. It was a memory from Althea's childhood. He saw her standing in the center of a large hall, surrounded by other Xyloxians, beautiful, elegant, perfect. But they were all staring at her, their expressions cold and judgmental. Althea, small and awkward, stood there, vulnerable and alone, as whispers surrounded her. She was different, and they didn't try to hide their disdain. The scene shifted, and he saw more of her life, moments where she was hidden away, moments where she was treated like an outcast, despite her royal blood. She had always been set apart, always made to feel like she didn't belong, simply because she didn't fit the impossible standards of beauty her people revered. Ethan felt her pain, her loneliness, as if it were his own. It hit him with a force that left him breathless. He had never known what it was like to be truly isolated in that way, to be judged so harshly for something beyond his control. And now, through this bond, he was experiencing it firsthand. When the vision ended, and he came back to himself, he couldn't look at Althea the same way. Everything he had assumed about her, everything he had thought he understood, shifted. She wasn't just the ugly princess hidden away from the world. She was someone who had endured years of rejection, someone who had lived with the weight of being different in a culture that prized conformity above all else. Ethan realized that their bond was more than just an alien connection. It was a bridge, one that allowed him to see her for who she really was, beyond the surface. He could sense the depth of her intelligence, her resilience, and her desire to be seen as more than just an outcast. It changed everything. Suddenly, her appearance didn't matter. What mattered was the person he had glimpsed beneath the surface, the person who had struggled her whole life to find acceptance. The bond between them had opened a door to something far deeper than he had expected, and Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But he knew one thing: this connection wasn't something he could ignore. It had already begun to transform how he saw her, and in turn, how he saw himself. Ethan had never been to space before this journey, but the view from the ship's observation window was unlike anything he had imagined. The endless sea of stars, the quiet hum of the engines, it felt peaceful. He was traveling with Althea, on their way back to Earth for diplomatic talks, a journey that would solidify their role as the new symbol of unity between humans and the Xyloxians. The tension between them had eased slightly since the wedding, but the bond still hummed in the background of his mind, a constant reminder that they were now connected in ways deeper than words. As they drifted through space, something shifted. The peaceful hum of the ship's systems turned into a sudden, jarring alarm. The lights flickered, and the steady course of the ship jolted, sending Ethan stumbling forward. Althea, seated nearby, was already alert, her glowing violet eyes scanning the controls. Before Ethan could ask what was happening, the ship lurched violently, as if something massive had grabbed it. Outside the window, the stars warped, twisting unnaturally, and a growing darkness loomed ahead. It was a black hole, its gravitational pull stronger than anything the ship's systems could handle. Panic gripped him as he realized they were being pulled into it. Althea moved quickly, her hands on the ship's controls, her face tense with concentration. Ethan could feel her mind racing through the bond, her thoughts focused on trying to stabilize the ship. But the ship wasn't responding. The gravitational anomaly was too strong, and despite her psychic abilities, she was struggling to maintain control. "This isn't working," she whispered, her voice trembling with frustration. "I can't hold it." Ethan felt the surge of fear through their connection, and it mirrored his own. He had never been in a situation like this, but he knew one thing: they were running out of time. The ship groaned as it was dragged closer to the black hole, and the systems began to fail one by one. The force of the pull was too much for the ship to withstand. But then, something clicked inside Ethan. This wasn't just about technology or psychic powers. This was about survival. And if there was one thing humans were good at, it was surviving against the odds. He had felt it before: the determination, the resilience, the unshakable will to fight back even when the situation seemed hopeless. Without thinking, Ethan reached out to Althea, grabbing her hand. The bond between them flared to life, stronger than it had ever been. He focused on that connection, on the raw emotions surging through him: fear, yes, but also courage. He let those feelings rise, filling the space between them, feeding into the bond. "Let me help," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Althea glanced at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. She hesitated for a moment but then nodded. She could sense the strength in him, the unyielding determination that was so uniquely human. Together, they closed their eyes, focusing on the bond that linked their minds, their energies. The ship shuddered again, but this time, Ethan could feel something different. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was part of the solution. As they synchronized their thoughts, the ship responded. It wasn't just Althea's psychic abilities holding it together now, it was the combined force of their connection. Ethan could feel his emotions feeding into the ship's systems, amplifying the control Althea had over it. The pull of the black hole was still strong, but Ethan's determination was stronger. He focused on everything he had learned from his life on Earth: the challenges, the struggles, the moments when giving up wasn't an option. Those memories flooded through him, through the bond, and into Althea. She could feel it too: the power of human resilience, something she had never fully understood before now. As they worked together, the ship began to stabilize. The black hole's pull was weakening, and they were regaining control. Althea's psychic energy, combined with Ethan's human spirit, was creating a force that neither of them could have achieved alone. But it wasn't easy. The strain of using the bond at this level was intense. Ethan could feel it draining him, pulling at every part of him, but he refused to let go. Althea, sensing his struggle, tried to ease the burden, but it was too late. They were too deep into it now. The connection had grown too powerful. The ship's systems finally flickered back to life, and with a final surge of energy, they broke free from the black hole's grasp. The stars outside the window returned to their normal patterns, and the ship leveled out, its engines humming back to life. But as the immediate danger passed, Ethan felt his body give out. The strain of using the bond had pushed him beyond his limits. His head spun, his vision blurred, and the next thing he knew, the darkness of unconsciousness was closing in on him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Althea's face, filled with concern, as she called out to him through their connection. And then, there was silence. Ethan stirred, his body heavy, his mind foggy as he opened his eyes to the soft light of the medical bay. The sterile scent and the quiet hum of machines told him where he was before he even registered the figures around him. He felt drained, every muscle aching as if he had run a marathon. But he was alive. The last thing he remembered was the black hole, the crushing force, and the overwhelming effort it had taken to hold everything together. Then nothing. Slowly, he turned his head and saw Althea sitting by his side, her eyes glowing softly with concern. There was a tension in her expression that he hadn't seen before, and through their bond, he could feel the lingering traces of her fear for him. The connection between them was stronger now, clearer, as if the ordeal had amplified it beyond anything they had experienced before. Her presence, once a distant hum in his mind, now felt like a steady pulse, intertwining with his own thoughts and emotions. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice filled with relief. She leaned forward, her hand hovering near his but not touching, as though unsure if she should. "I was worried. What we did, it was too much. You pushed yourself beyond what any human should have been able to endure." Ethan managed a weak smile. "Guess humans are tougher than you thought." Althea's expression softened, and he could feel her emotions shift: gratitude, admiration, and something else, something deeper. "I've never felt a bond like this before," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not with anyone. What we shared back there, it's stronger than any connection our people have ever formed. You saved us, Ethan. I couldn't have done it alone." He could sense how deeply this truth resonated with her, how much it had changed her view not only of their bond but of him. She wasn't just speaking about the physical act of saving the ship. It went beyond that. Their connection had evolved into something neither of them had expected. It was no longer just a forced union, or a political arrangement. It was real. Tangible. The door to the medical base slid open, and a group of Xyloxian officials entered. Ethan could immediately feel the shift in the room, their respect, their acknowledgement. These were the same people who had viewed him as an outsider, a necessary piece in a political puzzle. But now, there was something different in their eyes. The leader of the delegation, a tall figure with emerald-hued skin and a regal presence, stepped forward. "Ethan Harris of Earth," he began, his voice calm but filled with a new level of regard. "Your actions saved not only yourself and Princess Althea, but also prevented a disaster that would have rippled through our empire. We have underestimated your species, and we see now that there is more to humanity than we previously understood." Ethan tried to sit up straighter, his body protesting with every movement. He wasn't used to this kind of praise, especially not from the Xyloxians. But the weight of their words carried more than just respect. It was acknowledgement that humans, with their emotions, their resilience, had a strength that even the Xyloxians hadn't accounted for. The leader continued, "We have always valued logic, strength, and intellect, but today we learn that compassion, determination, and the bonds that tie individuals together are just as powerful. Your bond with Althea has shown us that there is much more to this union than we first anticipated. This marriage has brought more than peace, it has brought understanding." Ethan exchanged a glance with Althea, who smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the same realization. Their connection, which had once felt like a burden, was now being celebrated. It wasn't just about the alliance anymore. It was about something far more profound, a merging of two worlds, two cultures through the bond they had forged. When the officials left, Ethan and Althea sat in the quiet of the medical bay, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. For the first time since this whole journey began, Ethan didn't feel like he was drowning in uncertainty. He felt grounded, connected. Althea broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "When this started, I never thought we would reach this point. I didn't know if we could even connect at all. I was afraid that you would see me as different, as less." Ethan turned to face her fully, his gaze steady. "I won't lie, at first I didn't know what to think. I was scared too. Not just of you, but of this whole situation. It felt like I had no control over anything. But now, after everything, I see you, Althea. Not just as the princess, or the person I was forced to marry. I see who you are. You're stronger than anyone gives you credit for. And you're not less. Not at all." Her eyes shimmered with something unspoken, and through their bond, he could feel the surge of emotion, the relief that came with being truly seen. "I never thought someone would say that to me," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet vulnerability. He reached out and took her hand, their bond flaring to life with warmth and understanding. "I mean it. This marriage started as something political, something out of our control, but now, it's different. We're different. And I think this can be something real." Althea's grip on his hand tightened, her expression softening with a mix of hope and gratitude. "I never thought I'd find this, especially with a human. But I'm glad it's you, Ethan. I'm glad it's us." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air. For the first time since the beginning of their journey, the future didn't feel so daunting. It felt like something they could face together, not as two individuals forced into a marriage, but as partners. As they looked out the window of the medical bay, the stars stretching endlessly before them, Ethan felt a quiet sense of optimism settle over him. This wasn't just the beginning of their life as husband and wife, it was the beginning of something much larger. They weren't just a symbol of peace between two worlds. They were living proof that even in the vastness of space, with all its differences and challenges, understanding and connection could be found. And whatever the future held, they would face it together. Stronger than before.